Good afternoon. I convene this hearing of the Subcommittee of Oversight Investigation, Committee on Energy and Commerce.
Chairman, I can't see the witnesses right there.
We will need to make sure that the media is, when the witnesses are speaking, we are clear of the center section. Today, the world is fighting the worst Ebola epidemic in history. CDC and our public health system are in the middle of a fire. Job one is to put it out completely, and we will not stop until we do. We must be clear-eyed and singular in purpose to protect public health and to ensure not one additional case is contracted here in the United States. We in Congress stand ready to serve as a strong and solid partner in solving this crisis, because there is no greater responsibility for the U.S. government than to protect and defend the safety of the American people. The stakes of this battle couldn't be any higher. The number of Ebola cases in Western Africa is doubling about every 3 weeks. The math still favors the virus, even with the recent surge in global response. With no vaccine or cure, we are facing down a disease for which there is no room for error. We cannot afford to look back at this point in history and say we should have done more. Errors in judgment have been made, to be sure, and it is our immediate responsibility today to learn from those errors, correct them rapidly, and move forward effectively as one team, one fight. Let us candidly review where we stand. When the latest Ebola outbreak in West Africa was confirmed months ago, authorities thought it would be similar to the 1976 outbreaks and quickly contained. That turned out to be wrong. By underestimating both the severity of the danger and overstating the ability of our healthcare system to handle Ebola cases, mistakes have been made. What was adequate practice for the past has proven to fall short for the present. The trust and credibility of the administration and government are waning as the American public loses confidence each day with demonstrated failures of the current strategy. But that trust must be restored, but will only be restored with honest and thorough action. We have been told, quote, virtually any hospital in the country that can do isolation for Ebola, unquote. The events in Dallas have proven otherwise. Current policies and protocols for surveillance, containment, and response were not sufficient. False assumptions create real mistakes, sometimes deadly mistakes. We must understand what went wrong so we can get a firm handle on this crisis. Why was the CDC slow to deploy a rapid response team at Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital? Why weren't protocols to protect healthcare and hospital workers rapidly communicated? What training have healthcare workers received? And there are things about Ebola we don't know. How long does the virus live on surfaces or on certain substances? How do healthcare workers wearing full protective gear still get infected? Can it be transmitted from a person who does not yet have a high fever? Both CDC and NIH tell us that Ebola patients are only contagious when having a fever. However, the largest study of the current Ebola outbreak found that nearly 13% of confirmed cases in West Africa did not have associated fever. Now, I respect the CDC as the gold standard for public health, but the need for strong congressional oversight and partnership remains paramount. I want to understand why CDC and the White House changed course in 2010 on proposals first introduced in 2005 that would have strengthened the federal quarantine authority. We're here to work through these and fix these problems. I restate my ongoing concern that administrative officials still refuse to consider any travel restrictions for the more than 1,000 travelers entering the United States each week from Ebola hot zones. A month ago, the President told us someone with Ebola reaching our shores was unlikely, and that we've taken the necessary precautions to increase screening at airports so that someone with the virus does not get on a plane for the United States. Screening and self-reporting in airports have been a demonstrated failure. Yet the administration continues to advance a contradictory position for this failed policy that frankly doesn't make sense to me, especially if priority one is to contain the spread of Ebola and protect public health. It troubles me even more when public health policies are based upon a stated concern over cutting commercial ties with fledgling democracies rather than protecting public health in the United States. This should not be presented as an all-or-none choice. We can and will create the means to transport whatever supplies and goods are needed in Africa to win this deadly battle. We do not have to leave the door open to all travel to and from hot zones in Western Africa while Ebola is an unwelcome and dangerous stowaway on these flights. I'm confident we can develop a reasoned and successful strategy to meet these needs. The current airline passenger screening at 5 U.S. airports through temperature taking and self-reporting is troubling. Both CDC and NIH tell us that the Ebola patients are only contagious when having a fever. But we know this may not be totally accurate. A determined infected traveler can evade the screening by masking the fever with ibuprofen or avoiding the 5 airports. Further, it is nearly impossible to perform contact tracing of all people on multiple international flights across the globe. So let me be clear to all the federal agencies responding to the outbreak: if resources or authorization is needed to stop Ebola in its tracks, tell us in Congress. I pledge, and I believe this committee joins me in pledging, that we will do everything in our power to work with you to keep the American people safe from Ebola outbreak in West Africa. I now recognize the ranking member of the committee, Ms. DeGette. 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. On Monday, the Director General of the World Health Organization called the Ebola outbreak, quote, the most severe acute health emergency seen in modern times. She warned that the epidemic, quote, threatens the very survival of societies and governments in West Africa. This World WHO assessment is no exaggeration. CDC predicts that up to 1.4 million West Africans could be affected with Ebola. Many more will die from treatable illnesses due to the collapse of these countries' public health infrastructure. This is a humanitarian crisis, and we have a moral imperative to help in West Africa. But ending the West Africa outbreak is also a U.S. national security imperative, because doing so is the best way to keep Ebola out of the United States. I was alarmed, like all of us were, when Thomas Duncan flew to the U.S. while harboring Ebola, and even more disturbed to learn of his discharge from the Texas Presbyterian ER with a fever after reporting that he had traveled from Liberia. Even worse, we learned this week that 2 nurses treating Mr. Duncan, Nina Pham and Amber Vinson, have contracted Ebola. I know, Mr. Chairman, we all join in sending these women and their families our prayers. These new cases raise serious questions. The Washington Post wrote yesterday that Texas Presbyterian, quote, had to learn on the fly how to control the deadly virus, and that the hospital was, quote, not fully prepared for Ebola. We need to find out why this hospital was unprepared, and if others are too. And we need to make sure that the CDC is filling these readiness gaps. We should be concerned about the appearance of Ebola in the U.S. and the transmission to 2 healthcare workers, but we should not panic. We know how to stop Ebola outbreaks by isolating patients and tracing and monitoring contacts. The U.S. healthcare system can prevent isolated cases from becoming broader outbreaks. And that's why I'm glad Dr. Frieden is here with us and Dr. Varga will be with us by video, because it would be an understatement to say that the response to the first U.S.-based patient with Ebola has been mismanaged, causing risk to scores of additional people. I know both of these gentlemen will be transparent and forthright in helping me to understand how we can improve our response when yet another person, and it will inevitably happen, shows up at the emergency room with these kind of symptoms. I appreciate the steps taken by CDC and Customs to begin airport screenings. These steps are appropriate. And as some call for cutting off all travel, as the chairman said, this won't be reasonable to be able to stop anybody with Ebola from coming into the United States. And we don't want to take steps that would endanger Americans by interfering with efforts to halt the outbreak in Africa. You know, there's no such thing as Fortress America when it comes to infectious diseases. And the best way to stop Ebola is going to be to stop this virus in Africa. Experts from Doctors Without Borders have told us that a quarantine on travel would have the, quote, catastrophic impacts on West Africa. Also, earlier this week, the director of NIH, Dr. Francis Collins, said had we adequately funded his agency for over a decade, we would already have an Ebola vaccine. His words are a reminder that key public health agencies have faced stagnant funding for several years, hampering our ability to respond to this crisis. Mr. Chairman, 6 weeks ago, when I first sent you a letter to ask for this hearing, the scope of the problem in West Africa was beginning to come into focus. Now the situation is dire. Let's work together to make sure that we stop it as quickly as we can. With that, I yield the balance of my time to the gentleman from Iowa, Mr. Braley.
Thank you. Our duty today is to make sure the administration is doing everything possible to prevent the spread of Ebola within the United States. Our #1 priority in combating this disease must be the protection of Americans, and we have to figure out the best way to do that. My heart goes out to all those suffering from this horrible epidemic, and I'm very proud of the hard work done by American troops, doctors, nurses, and other volunteers to combat this disease. Congress must come together, put aside partisan differences, and help stop this outbreak. Today, I hope to hear what steps the administration is taking to prevent the spread of Ebola and respond to the outbreak. I'm greatly concerned, as Congresswoman DeGette has expressed, that the administration did not act fast enough in responding in Texas. We need to look at all the options available to keep our families safe and move quickly and responsibly to make any necessary changes at airports and
Gentleman's time's
hospitals.
expired. Okay. We have a lot to do here, so we'll just keep going. Okay? Okay, thank you. Thank you. Now recognize the Chairman of the full committee, Mr. Upton, for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you. Let me first begin by thanking our witnesses and all the members, Republicans and Democrats, for being here today. You know, it's unusual to convene a hearing in D.C. during a district work period, but on this issue there is no time to wait. I was likewise glad to see the President get off the campaign trail yesterday to finally focus on the crisis. People are scared. We need all hands on deck. We need a strategy, and we need to protect the American people, first and foremost. It's not a drill. People's lives are at stake, and the response so far has been unacceptable. As chairman of this committee, I want to assure the witnesses that we stand ready to support you in any way to keep Americans safe. But we're going to hold your feet to the fire on getting the job done and getting it done right. Both the U.S. and the global health community have so far failed to put in place an effective strategy fast enough to combat the current outbreak. The CDC admitted more could have been done in Texas. 2 healthcare workers have become infected with Ebola, even as nurses and other medical personnel suggest that protocols are being developed on the fly. And none of us can understand how a nurse who treated an Ebola-infected patient and who had herself developed a fever was permitted to board a commercial airline and fly across the country. It's no wonder that the public's confidence is shaken. Over a month ago, before Ebola reached our shores, we wrote HHS Secretary Burwell seeking details for the preparedness and response plan here at home and abroad. And it's clear whatever plan was in place was insufficient, but I believe that we can and must do better now. We need a plan to treat those who are sick, to train healthcare workers to safely provide care, and to stop the spread of this disease here at home and at its source in Africa. This includes travel restrictions or bans from that region beginning today. Surely we can find other ways to get the aid workers and supplies into these countries, and from the terrorist watch lists to quarantines, there are tools used to manage air travel to assure public safety. Why not here? We can no longer be reacting to each day's crisis. We need to be aggressive and finally get ahead of this terrible outbreak. The American people also want to know about our troops and medical personnel who are courageously headed to Africa to treat the sick. How are they going to be protected? We want to know that healthcare workers here in America have the training and resources necessary to safely combat that threat as well. So it's not just the responsibility of the U.S. The global health community bears the charge to finally get ahead of the threat, develop a clear strategy, train all of those involved in combating this disease, and eradicate the threat. We have all heard the grave warnings that this is going to get worse before it gets better. People are scared. It is our responsibility to ensure that the government is doing whatever it can to keep the public safe. Diana DeGette and I have partnered together on the 21st Century Cures Initiative to help improve the research and speed the approval of life-saving medicines and treatments. And while much attention has been paid on how this effect can help with diseases like cancer and diabetes, the same reforms have to help us in the development of treatments for deadly infections like Ebola. We are partners in this effort to save lives. I yield the balance of my time to Dr. Burgess.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My thanks to the panel for being here today, and I think everyone here agrees we must fix this. America's response to the Ebola virus disease outbreak is not a political issue. It's a public health crisis, and a very dire one at that. The frightening truth is that we cannot guarantee the safety of our healthcare workers on the front lines. It has been known for some time that healthcare workers have an outsized risk in Western Africa. 56% of the they have a 56% mortality rate of those healthcare workers who catch this disease. 2 nurses have contracted Ebola in the United States, and indeed we have to learn from the current situation in Texas and use any information we can gather to better help prepare hospitals and protect our healthcare workers on the front line. We are here today because we need answers to these questions. This past August, the Inspector General of the Department of Homeland Security issued a report on personal protective equipment and antiviral countermeasures. They found that, in quoting here, the Department of Homeland Security did not adequately conduct a needs assessment prior to purchasing pandemic preparedness supplies and then did not effectively manage its stockpile of personal protective equipment and antiviral medical countermeasures. This just illustrates how unprepared that we are. We have to get this right. I would like to yield the balance of my time to Ms. Blackburn from Tennessee.
Thank you, Dr. Burgess. And yes, indeed, welcome to all of our witnesses. Everyone has mentioned we're here to work with you to protect Americans, and that includes the caregivers. And by that, I mean the men and women working on the front lines, the screaming eagles of the 101st from Fort Campbell. I will yield back my time and have further questions later. Thank you.
Gentleman yields back and time expired. I would now like to introduce the witnesses. I'm sorry. No, first I go to Mr. Waxman. I apologize.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I'm pleased to have this opportunity to make an opening statement before we hear from the witnesses. I think we have to put all of this in perspective and not panic. Everybody said not panic, and then they made statements like, we're going to get tough, we're going to do something about it. Well, what do we need to do? First of all, we've got a problem in Africa, and this is a serious outbreak that could spiral beyond our control. On Tuesday, the World Health Organization estimated that soon there could be up to 10,000 new Ebola cases each week in West Africa. And CDC has warned that the outbreak could infect as many as 1.4 million people by the end of January. So this is a humanitarian crisis in Africa, and we have a responsibility to help, because if we don't help there, that outbreak is going to continue and spiral out to other places. And sealing people off in Africa is not going to keep them from traveling. They'll travel to Brussels, as one of the people did, and then into the United States. We can stop the epidemic from spreading in Africa or in the United States if we isolate the patient and contact and monitor the contacts of that patient. And if we do that, we can stop it there and we could stop it here. So in Africa, we need to know, are we moving fast enough? Responders have adequate resources? Are we effectively coordinating our response with other countries and international organizations? But here, people are scared, and we shouldn't make them even more frightened. Put this in perspective. We've had 3 recent cases of Ebola in this country. Thomas Duncan, who entered the U.S. while harboring Ebola and who flew through Brussels to get here. Nina Pham and Amber Vinson, the nurses who became ill while caring for Mr. Duncan. We should be concerned about these cases, and we need to act urgently, but we need not to panic. What we have to do is learn what we need to do, what mistakes we have made, and not repeat them. We want to find out what happened at Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital, how CDC, state and local health officials and hospitals can improve procedures moving forward. We should also use this as a wake-up call to ensure the adequacy of our own public health and preparedness safety net. We need to be prepared before a crisis hits, not scrambling to respond after the crisis. In the past decade, the ability to fund research and public health programs has declined here in the United States. Since 2006, CDC's budget, adjusted for inflation, has dropped by 12%. Funding for the Public Health Emergency Preparedness Cooperative Agreement, which supports state and local health department preparedness activities, has been cut from $1 billion in its first year of funding in 2002 to $612 million in 2014. All of these were also subject to the sequestration And those who allowed that sequestration to happen by closing the government have to answer to the American people as well. We need to commit adequate funding to public health infrastructure. We need to hold public health systems accountable to standards of preparedness. Based on what we know, it appears that Texas Presbyterian would have not met those standards. Though in fairness, I suspect that many hospitals all over the country would also have struggled to respond. This is a problem we have to solve. Mr. Chairman, before I run out of time, I want to acknowledge the healthcare workers and volunteers, those treating Ebola victims in the U.S. and those who have traveled to West Africa to help during this outbreak. It's a dangerous work that they're doing. They're putting themselves in danger to save lives. They deserve our thanks and our praise. I also want to thank all of our witnesses. You have my confidence, and I appreciate you joining us today to provide answers about how to stop the current Ebola outbreak in Africa and how to improve our public health systems to avoid the next crisis. I'm ending my career at the end of this year, but I've been through so many hearings where when there's a crisis, we have congressmen sit and point fingers. Well, let's point fingers at all of those responsible. We have our share of responsibility by not funding the infrastructure. In Africa, they have no infrastructure. We have to help them develop it to deal with this crisis, but we shouldn't leave ourselves vulnerable by these irrational budget cuts.
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. I would now like to introduce the witnesses on the panel for today's hearing. Dr. Thomas R. Frieden is the Director of the Centers for Disease Control and Prevention. Dr. Anthony Fauci is the Director of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases within the National Institute of Health. Dr. Robin Robinson is the Director of Biomedical Advanced Research and Development Authority within the Office of the Assistant Secretary for Preparedness and Response at the United States Department of Health and Human Services. Dr. Luciana Borio is the Assistant Commissioner for Counterterrorism Policy at the U.S. Food and Drug Administration. Mr. John P. Wagner is the Acting Assistant Commissioner of the Office of Field Operations within U.S. Customs and Border Protection at the U.S. Department of Homeland Security. And joining us today on video conference from Texas will be Dr. Daniel Varga, who is the Chief Clinical Officer and Senior Vice President at the Texas Health Resources. He'll be joining us in a moment. I'll now swear in the witnesses. You are all aware that the committee is holding an investigative hearing, and when doing so has had the practice of taking testimony under oath. Do any of you have any objections to taking testimony under oath?
No.
And the witnesses say so, and Dr. Varga?
No.
Thank you. The chair then advises you that under the rules of the House and the rules of the committee, you are entitled to be advised by counsel. Do any of you desire to be advised by counsel during your testimony today?
No.
Dr. Varga?
No.
Okay, thank you. Everyone answers no. In that case, would you all please rise and raise your right hand, and I will swear you in. Do you swear the testimony you are about to give is the truth, the whole truth, and nothing but the truth?
I do.
Thank you.
I do.
Thank you, Doctor. You are now under oath and subject to the penalties set forth in Section 18, in Title 18, Section 1001 of the United States Code. We'll call upon you each to give a 5-minute opening summary of your written statement. Dr. Frieden, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you very much, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, Chairman Upton, and Ranking Member Waxman. I very much appreciate the opportunity to come before you to discuss the Ebola epidemic and our response to it to protect Americans. My name is Dr. Tom Frieden. I'm trained as a physician. I'm trained in internal medicine, in infectious diseases. I completed the CDC Epidemic Intelligence Service training, and I've worked in the control of diseases, communicable diseases and others since 1990. Ebola spreads only by direct contact with a patient who is sick with the disease or has died from it, or with their body fluids. Ebola is not new, although it's new to the U.S. We know how to control Ebola. Even in this period, even in Lagos, Nigeria, we've been able to contain the outbreak. We do that by tried and true measures of finding the patients promptly, isolating them effectively, identifying their contacts, ensuring that if any contact becomes ill, they are rapidly identified, isolated, and their contacts are identified. But there are no shortcuts in the control of Ebola, and it is not easy to control it. To protect the United States, we have to stop it at the source. There is a lot of fear of Ebola, and I will tell you, as the director of CDC, one of the things I fear about Ebola is that it could spread more widely in Africa. If this were to happen, it could become a threat to our health system and the health care we give for a long time to come. Our top priority, our focus, is to work 24/7 to protect Americans. That's our mission. We protect Americans from threats, and in the case of Ebola, we do that by a system at multiple levels. In addition to our efforts to control the disease at the source, we have helped each of the affected countries establish exit screening so that every person leaving has their temperature taken. In the 2-month period of August and September, we identified 74 people with fever. None of them entered the airport or boarded the plane. As far as we know, none of them were diagnosed with Ebola, but that was one level of safety. Recently, we've added another level of screening people on arrival to the U.S. That identifies anyone with fever here, and we've worked very closely with the Department of Homeland Security and the Customs and Border Protection to implement that program, and I would be happy to provide further details of it later. We've also increased awareness among physicians throughout the U.S. to think Ebola in anyone who has fever or other symptoms of infection and who's been to West Africa in the previous 21 days. We've established laboratory services throughout the country so that not all laboratory tests have to come to the specialized laboratory at CDC. In fact, one of those laboratories in Austin, Texas, identified the first case here. We also have fielded calls from concerned doctors and public health officials throughout the country. We found more than 300 calls, and only one patient, Mr. Duncan, had Ebola, but that's one too many. And we're open to ideas for what we can do to keep Americans as safe as possible as long as the outbreak is continuing. We also have established emergency response teams from CDC that will go within hours to any hospital that has an Ebola case to help them provide effective care safely. There's a lot of understandable concern about the cases in Dallas. I have one slide, if we can show it, of the contact tracing activities there, and I think we provided copies for the members. The two core activities in Dallas are to ensure that there is effective infection control and to trace contacts. Here you see a timeline of exactly what has happened in the identification of contacts. We have followed each of the contacts. When any become ill, or if any become ill, we immediately isolate them so that we can break the chain of transmission. That's how you stop Ebola. I can go through the details when you wish. We also are working to ensure that there's effective infection control there, and I can go through the details of that. In sum, CDC works 24/7 to protect Americans. There are no shortcuts. Everyone has to do their part. There are more than 5,000 hospitals in this country. There are more than 2,500 health departments at the local level. We're there to support. We're there with world-class expertise, and we're there to respond to threats so that we can help protect Americans, and we're always open to new ideas. We're always open to data because our bottom line is using the most accurate data and information to inform our actions and protect health. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Fried. Now recognize Dr. Fauci for a 5-minute summary of your statement.
Thank you, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Members DeGette and Upton, Ranking Member Waxman. You've just heard about the public health aspects of Ebola virus disease from Dr. Frieden. I appreciate the opportunity to speak with you this morning for a few minutes on the role of the National Institute of Allergy and Infectious Diseases in research addressing Ebola virus disease. Of note is that our activities actually started with the tragic events of 9/11, if I could, of 9/11/2001, which were followed closely by the anthrax attacks, which many of the members remember, against the Congress of the United States and the press. It was in that environment that a multifaceted approach towards bioterrorism was actually mounted by the federal government, one of which was the research endeavor to develop countermeasures. We soon became very aware that naturally occurring outbreaks of disease are just as much of a terror to the American and world public as a deliberate bioterror. You see on this slide a number of what we call Category A pathogens, from anthrax, botulism, plague, smallpox, tularemia, but look at the last bullet, the viral hemorrhagic fevers, including Ebola, Marburg, Lassa, and others. The viral hemorrhagic fevers are particularly difficult because they have a high degree of lethality and high infectivity upon contact with body fluids. Therapy is mainly supportive without specific interventions, and we do not have a vaccine. And so what is the role of the National Institutes of Health? We could advance the slide. The role of the National Institutes of Health in the research endeavor. As you can see on the slide, we do basic and clinical research, and importantly, we apply and supply resources for researchers in industry and academia to advance product development. The end game of what we do are diagnostics, therapeutics, and vaccines. I'm sorry, could we get the slide back on the last slide? No, the previous one. I'm very sorry. Could we get it back? There, right there. This is a multi-institutional endeavor. As you can see on the slide, the NIH is responsible for fundamental basic research and early concept development, something that we did relatively alone because of the lack of interest on the industrial partners of making interventions. We partner with BARDA, who you'll hear from shortly, with Dr. Robin Robinson, and then we partner with industry, as we've done in a moment, as I'll tell you, to ultimately, in collaboration with the FDA, to get the approval of products. Next slide. You've heard a lot about therapeutic interventions. I'd just like to spend a moment talking to you about a few of them. First, it's important to realize that they are all experimental. None of them have proven to be effective. So when you hear about giving a drug that has a positive effect, we do not know at this point, A, is it a positive effect, or B, is it causing harm? And that's the reason why we need to study these carefully. At the same time, we rapidly can make them available to the people who need them. The first one on the list is ZMapp. You've heard of it. That was given to Dr. Brantley and Nancy Reichbold. It looks very good in an animal model. It still needs to be proven in the human. There are others, such as the BioCryst product, which is a nucleoside analog. You've heard about the Tecmira drug, which was developed in support by the Department of Defense, which is also being used, and others that you'll hear about, such as brincidofovir and favipiravir. These are just a few of those, again, that will be going into clinical trials and that are actually being used in an experimental way with a compassionate use with approval from the FDA in certain individuals. Let me turn to this slide here, which is an important one. Slides regarding a vaccine. We have been working on an Ebola vaccine for a number of years. We did the original studies shown in an animal model to be quite favorable. We are now right at the phase where we are in phase 1 trials that some of you may have heard of, started at the NIH on September the 2nd. A second vaccine was started just a couple of days ago by the U.S. military in collaboration with the NIH. When we finish those phase 1 trials, namely asking, is it safe and does it induce a response that you would predict would be protective? It's important to make sure it's safe. If those parameters are met, we will advance to a much larger trial in larger numbers of individuals to determine if it is actually effective, as well as not having a paradoxical, negative, deleterious effect. The reason we think this is important is that if we do not control the epidemic with pure public health measures, it is entirely conceivable that we may need a vaccine, and it's important to prove that it is safe and effective. I'd like to close by making an announcement to this committee because I'm sure you'll hear about it soon in the press. This evening, tonight, we will be admitting to the Clinical Studies Unit, the Special Clinical Studies Unit at the National Institutes of Health, Nina Pham, otherwise known as Nurse Number 1. She will be coming to the National Institutes of Health, where we'll be supplying her with a state-of-the-art care in our high-level containment facilities. Thank you very much, Mr. Chairman.
Thank you, Doctor. Now recognize Dr. Robinson for a 5-minute summary of your statement.
Good afternoon, Chairman Murphy, Chairman Upton, Ranking Members Aguette and Waxman, and other distinguished members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to speak with you today about our efforts by the government on Ebola. I am Dr. Robin Robinson, a former vaccine developer in the industry, and for the last 10 years a public servant working on pandemic preparedness and many other biothreats. BARDA was created by the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Act in 2006. It is the government agency responsible for supporting advanced development and procurement of novel and innovative medical countermeasures such as vaccines, therapeutic drugs, diagnostics, and medical devices for the entire nation. BARDA exists to address the medical consequences of biothreats and emerging infectious diseases. BARDA has supported medical countermeasure development for man-made threats on a routine basis under Project BioShield and responded to emerging threats like H1N1 pandemic in 2009 and the avian influenza H7N9 outbreak in China last year. Today, we are immersed in responding to Ebola, which is simultaneously a biothreat with a material threat determination issued by the Department of Homeland Security and an emerging infectious disease. As you have said, and my colleagues have said, when it comes to Ebola as a biothreat and emerging infectious disease, the best way to protect our country is to address the current epidemic in Africa, the worst on record. BARDA works with its federal partners to transition the medical countermeasures from early development, as Dr. Fauci said, into advanced development towards ultimate FDA approval. Since 2006, we have built an advanced development pipeline of more than 150 medical countermeasures for chemical, biological, radiological, nuclear threats, and pandemic influenza. 7 of these products have been FDA approved in the last 2 years, and today we are transitioning several promising and maturing Ebola vaccines and therapeutic candidates from early development under NIH and DoD support into advanced development and ensuring that commercial-scale manufacturing capacity for these product candidates is available as soon as possible. BARDA, in concert with our federal partners, utilizes public-private partnerships with industry to ensure that we have countermeasures to protect our citizens. Over the past 5 years, BARDA, with NIH, CDC, and FDA, and our industry partners have built a flexible and rapid responsive infrastructure to develop and manufacture medical countermeasures. As a result of the Pandemic and All Hazard Preparedness Reauthorization Act, an improved framework for medical countermeasure development has been afforded to federal and industry partners. And last year, we made 5 new vaccine candidates in record time for the H7N9 outbreaks in China. Currently, we're working with a wider array of partners, including both small and large pharmaceutical companies, Canada, the UK, Western African countries, the World Health Organization, and others, to make and evaluate the safety and efficacies of these Ebola product candidates. BARDA has established a medical countermeasure infrastructure to assist product developers on a daily basis to respond immediately in a public health emergency. We're using a number of our core service assistance programs, such as the Non-Clinical Studies Network, our Centers for Innovation and Advanced Development and Manufacturing, and our fill finish manufacturing network to make these products available as soon as possible. Additionally, our staff are on site at the manufacturer, people in plant, to provide technical assistance and oversight to expedite product availability. Additionally, we're working with CDC and others across the federal government and internationally with our modeling efforts to look at the Ebola outbreak and as it becomes epidemic, and also what possible impacts interventions may occur. BARDA supports large-scale production of medical countermeasures as a response measure for public health emergencies like the H1N1 pandemic and H7N9 outbreaks. Today, we are assisting Ebola vaccine and therapeutic manufacturers with scaled-up production. Specifically, we're supporting the development and manufacturing of ZMapp monoclonal antibody therapy for clinical studies at one manufacturer, expanding overall manufacturing capacity of ZMapp by enlisting the help of other tobacco plant-based manufacturers, and working on alternative Ebola monoclonal antibody candidates to expand production capacity. Pending the outcome of ongoing animal challenge studies, BARDA is prepared to support advanced development of additional promising therapeutic candidates that Dr. Fauci talked about to treat Ebola patients. On the vaccine front, BARD is working with industry partners to scale up manufacturing of 3 promising Ebola vaccine candidates, one of which we will make an announcement today, from pilot scale to commercial scale for clinical studies in Africa next year. In addition to BARDA's efforts in the Ebola response, ASPR is supporting a number of other response activities, including supporting healthcare system preparedness, developing policies and guidance on patient movement, repatriation, standards of care, and clinical guidance, supporting the logistical aspect of deploying U.S. public health service officers to West Africa, and ongoing coordination and communication with national and international communities responding to the threat. Finally, we face significant challenges, as have been discussed, in the coming weeks and months with the Ebola epidemic continuing and as these medical countermeasures are manufactured and evaluated. But bottom line is that my colleagues here and our industry partners will use all of our collective capabilities here and abroad to address today's Ebola epidemic and to be better prepared for future Ebola outbreaks and bioterrorism events going forward. I want to thank the committee and subcommittee for your generous and continued support over the past decade and the opportunity to testify. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr. Robertson. Dr. Boria, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you. Good afternoon, Chairman Murphy.
Could you just please pull the microphone as close to you as possible? Thank you.
Good afternoon, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the subcommittee. Thank you for the opportunity to appear before you today to discuss FDA's actions to respond to the Ebola epidemic, a tragic global event. My colleagues and I at the FDA are determined to do all we can to help end it as quickly as possible. The desire and need for safe and effective vaccines and treatments is overwhelming. FDA is taking extraordinary steps to be proactive and flexible. We're leveraging our authorities and working diligently to expedite the development, manufacturing, and availability of safe and effective medical products for Ebola. We're providing FDA's unique scientific and regulatory advice to companies to guide their submissions. We're reviewing data as it is received. These actions help advance the development of investigational products as quickly as possible. And for example, in the case of the 2 vaccines that Dr. Fauci mentioned, FDA took only a few days to review the applications and to allow the studies to proceed. As a result, the vaccine candidate being co-developed by the NIAID and GlaxoSmithKline began phase 1 clinical testing on September 2nd, and the vaccine candidate being developed by New Link Genetics began similar clinical testing on October 13th. We're also partnering with the U.S. government agencies that support medical product development, including NIAID, BARDA, and the Department of Defense. Because of FDA's long-standing collaboration with the DoD, FDA was able to authorize the use of the Ebola diagnostic test under our emergency use authorization within 24 hours of request. We authorized the use of 2 additional diagnostic tests developed by the CDC, and these tests, of course, are essential for an effective public health response. In addition, we're supporting the World Health Organization. Our scientists are providing technical advice to the WHO as it works to assess the role of convalescent plasma in treating patients with Ebola. I recently participated in a consultation focused on Ebola vaccines in Geneva, which included dozens of experts from around the world, as well as from affected and neighboring countries in West Africa. Participants agreed that promising investigational vaccines must be evaluated in scientifically valid clinical trials and in the most urgent manner. FDA is working closely with our government colleagues and the vaccine developers to support this goal. It is important to note, though, that while we all want access to immediate therapies to cure or prevent Ebola, the scientific fact is that these investigational products are in the earliest stages of development. There is tremendous hope that some of these products will help patients, but it is also possible that some may hurt patients and others may have little or no effect. Therefore, access to investigational products should be through clinical trials when possible. They allow us to learn about product safety and efficacy, and they can provide an equitable means for access. FDA is working with our NIH colleagues to develop a flexible and innovative clinical trial protocol to allow companies and clinicians to evaluate multiple investigational Ebola products under a common protocol. The goal is to ensure accrual of interpretable data and generate actionable results in the most expeditious manner. It is important for the global community to know the risks and benefits of these products as soon as possible. Until such trials are established, we will continue to enable access to these products when available and requested by clinicians. We have mechanisms such as compassionate use, which allow access to investigation of products outside of clinical trials when we assess that the expected benefits outweigh the potential risks for the patient. I can tell you that every Ebola patient in the U.S. has been treated with at least one investigational product. Because Ebola is such a serious and often rapidly fatal disease, FDA has approved such requests within a matter of a few hours, and oftentimes in less than 1 hour. There are more than 250 FDA staff involved in this response, and without exception, everyone has been proactive, thoughtful, and adaptive to the complex range of issues that have emerged. We are fully committed to sustaining our deep engagement and aggressive activities to support a robust response to the Ebola epidemic. Thank you, and I'll take your questions later.
Thank you, Dr. Burrow. Mr. Wagner, you're recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Chairman Murphy, Ranking Member DeGette, and distinguished members of the subcommittee for the opportunity to discuss the efforts of U.S. Customs and Border Protection in deterring the spread of Ebola by means of international travel. Each day, about 1 million travelers arrive in the United States. About 280,000 of them arrive at our international airports. CBP is responsible for securing our nation's borders while facilitating the flow of legitimate international travel and trade that is so vital to our nation's economy. Within this broad responsibility, our priority mission remains to prevent terrorists and terrorist weapons from entering the United States. However, we also play an important role in limiting the introduction, transmission, and spread of serious communicable diseases from foreign countries. We've had this role for over 100 years, and in coordination with CDC, we've had modern protocols in place for well over a decade that have guided response to a variety of significant health threats. CBP officers at all ports of entry assess each traveler for overt signs of illness. In response to the recent Ebola virus outbreak in West Africa, CBP, in close collaboration with CDC, is working to ensure that frontline officers are provided the information, training, and equipment needed to identify and respond to international travelers who may pose a threat to public health. All CBP officers are provided guidance and training on identifying and addressing travelers with any potential illness, including communicable diseases such as the Ebola virus. CBP officer training includes CDC public health training, which teaches officers to identify through visual observation and questioning the overt symptoms and characteristics of ill travelers. CBP also provides operational training and guidance on how to respond to travelers with potential illness, including referring individuals who display signs of illness to CDC quarantine officers for secondary screening, as well as training on assisting CDC with implementation of its isolation and quarantine protocols. Additionally, CBP provides training for its frontline personnel by covering key elements of CBP's bloodborne pathogens exposure control plan, protections from exposure, use of personal protective equipment, other preventive measures, and procedures to follow in a potential exposure incident. We are committed to ensuring our field personnel have the most accurate, updated information regarding this virus. Since the outbreak began, CBP field personnel have been provided a steady stream of guidance, starting with initial information on the current outbreak at the beginning of April this year, with numerous and regular updates since then. Information sharing is critical, and CBP continues to engage with health and medical authorities. Since January of 2011, CDC's Division of Global Migration and Quarantine has stationed a liaison officer at our National Targeting Center to provide subject matter expertise and facilitate requests for information between the two organizations. Starting October 1st this year, CBP began providing Ebola information notices to travelers entering the United States from Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone. This tear sheet provides the traveler information and instructions should he or she have a concern of possible infection. In addition to visually screening all passengers for overt signs of illness, starting October 11th, CBP and CDC began enhanced screening of travelers from the 3 affected countries entering at JFK Airport, and today we expanded these enhanced efforts at Dulles, Chicago O'Hare, Atlanta, and Newark. Approximately 94% of travelers from the affected countries enter the United States through these 5 airports. In coordination with CDC, these targeted travelers are asked to complete a CDC questionnaire, provide contact information, and have their temperature checked. Based on these enhanced screening efforts, CDC quarantine officers will make a public health assessment. Since the additional measures went into effect at JFK, CBP has conducted enhanced screening on 155 travelers who were identified in advance as being known to have traveled through one of these 3 affected countries. Additional 13 travelers were identified by CBP officers as needing additional screening during the course of our standard interview process that's applied at all ports of entry. A total of 8 of these travelers have been sent to tertiary screening by CDC, and it's important to note that so far all passengers were examined and released. While CBP officers receive training in illness recognition and response, if they identify an individual believed to be ill, CBP will isolate the traveler from the public in a designated area and contact the local CDC quarantine officer, along with local public health authorities, to help with further medical assessment. CBP officers are trained to employ universal precautions, an infection control approach developed by CDC when they encounter individuals with overt symptoms of illness or contaminated items in examinations of baggage and cargo. When necessary, CBP personnel will take the appropriate safety measures based on the level of potential exposure. These procedures, designed to minimize risk to our officers and to the public, have been utilized collaboratively by both agencies on a number of occasions with positive results. CBP will continue to monitor the Ebola outbreak, provide timely information and guidance to our field personnel, work closely with our interagency partners to develop or adopt measures as needed to deter the spread of Ebola in the United States. So thank you for the opportunity to testify today and the attention you're giving to this very important issue. I'll be happy to answer any of your questions.
Thank you. Now we're going to recognize Dr. Daniel Varga, Chief Clinical Officer joining us from Texas on video conference. Dr. Varga.
Good afternoon, Chairman Murphy, Vice Chair Burgess, Ranking Member DeGette, and members of the committee. My name is Dr. Daniel Varga. I'm the Chief Clinical Officer and Senior Executive Vice President for Texas Health Resources. I'm board certified in internal medicine and have more than 24 years of combined experience in patient practice, medical education, and healthcare administration. I am truly sorry that I could not be with you in person today, and I deeply appreciate the committee's understanding of our situation and how important it is for me to be here in Dallas during this very challenging and sensitive time. Texas Health Presbyterian Hospital Dallas is one of 13 wholly owned acute care hospitals in the Texas Health Resources System. We are an 898-bed hospital treating some of the most complicated cases in North Texas in terms of, in North Texas. Texas Health Dallas is recognized as a magnet designated facility for excellence in nursing services by the American Nurses Credentialing Center, the nation's leading nursing credentialing program. Texas Health Resources is one of the largest faith-based centers, not-for-profit health systems in the U.S., and the largest in North Texas in terms of patients served. Our mission is to improve the health of the people in the communities we serve, and we care for all patients regardless of their ability to pay. We serve diverse communities, and as such, we provide one standard of care for all, regardless of race or country of origin. As the first hospital in the country to both diagnose and treat a patient with Ebola, we are committed to using our experience to help other hospitals and healthcare providers protect public health against this insidious virus. It is hard for me to put into words how we felt when our patient Thomas Eric Duncan lost his struggle with Ebola on October 8th. It was devastating to the nurses, doctors, and team who tried so hard to save his life, and we keep his family in our thoughts and prayers. Unfortunately, in our initial treatment of Mr. Duncan, despite our best intentions and a highly skilled medical team, we made mistakes. We did not correctly diagnose his symptoms as those of Ebola, and we are deeply sorry. Also, in our effort to communicate to the public quickly and transparently, we inadvertently provided some information that was inaccurate and had to be corrected. No doubt, that was unsettling to a community that was already concerned and confused, and we have learned from that experience as well. Last weekend, Nurse Nina Pham, a member of our hospital family who courageously cared for Mr. Duncan, was also diagnosed with Ebola. Our team is doing everything possible to help her win that fight, and on Tuesday, her condition was upgraded to good, and as Dr. Fauci mentioned earlier, Nina's care continues to evolve. I can tell you that the prayers of the entire Texas Health system are with her. Yesterday, as has been noted, we identified a second caregiver with Ebola, and I can also tell you that our thoughts and prayers remain with Amber as well. A lot is being said about what may or may not have occurred to cause Nina and Amber to contract Ebola. We know that they are both extremely skilled nurses, and we're using full protective measures under the CDC protocols so we don't yet know precisely how or when they were infected. But it's clear there was an exposure somewhere, sometime, and we are poring over records and observations and doing all we can to find the answers. You've asked about the sequence of events with regard to our preparedness for Ebola and our treatment of Mr. Duncan. Key events from our preparation timeline are attached to our submitted statement, but here's a brief overview. As the Ebola epidemic in Africa worsened over the summer, Texas Health, hospitals, and facilities began educating our physicians, nurses, and other staff on the symptoms and risk factors associated with the virus. On July 28th, an infection prevention nurse specialist at Texas Health received the first Centers for Disease Control and Prevention health advisory about Ebola virus disease and began sharing it with other Texas Health personnel. The healthcare advisory encouraged all healthcare providers in the U.S. to consider EVD in the diagnosis of febrile illness, in other words, a fever, in persons who had recently traveled to affected countries. The CDC advisory was also sent to all directors of our emergency departments, and signage was also posted in the EDs. On August 1st, Texas Health leaders, including all regional and hospital leaders and the ED leaders across our system, received an email directing that all hospitals have a hospital epidemiologic emergency policy in place to address how to care for patients with Ebola-like symptoms. The email also drew attention to the fact that our electronic health record documentation in emergency departments included a question about travel history to be completed on every patient. Attachments to the email included a draft THR epidemiologic emergencies policy that specifically addressed DVD, CDC-based poster to be posted in the ED, and the CDC advisory from 7/28. The August 1 CDC guidelines and evaluation of U.S. patients suspected of having Ebola virus disease was distributed to staff, including physicians, nurses, and other frontline caregivers on August 1st and August 4th. Over the last 2 months, the Dallas County Health and Human Services Department communicated with us frequently as plans and preparatory work were put in place for a possible case of Ebola. We have also provided the August 27th Dallas County Health Department algorithm and screening questionnaire. At 10:30 p.m. on September 25th, Mr. Duncan presented to Texas Health.
Undertaking. Dr. Frieden, I want to clarify something that you had said earlier. I believe you mentioned that there are approximately 100 to 150 people a day coming into the United States from the affected areas?
That's my understanding, yes.
And to Mr. Wagner, you had mentioned that we're screening 94% of those people?
As of today, with the expansion to the 4 additional locations, that covers about 94%.
Okay, so of the 100 to 150, 94% are being covered. That means that somewhere between 2 a year are coming into this country without being screened from the affected areas?
Well, they would undergo a different form of screening. We're still going to identify that they've been to one of those 3 affected regions, and we're still going to ask them questions about their itinerary. We're going to be alert to any overt signs of illness and coordinate with CDC and public health if they're sick. And we're also going to give them a fact sheet about Ebola, about the symptoms, what to watch for, and most importantly, who to contact.
Would we be checking their temperature?
We will not be checking the temperatures or having them fill out a contact sheet or about their.
So there's 2,000 to 3,000 people entering this country a year without checking their temperature, without having the contact sheet that 94% of those affected people.
They're going to arrive at hundreds of different airports throughout the United States.
Okay. I want to talk a little bit more about the travel restrictions. Dr. Frieden, how many non-U.S. military flights, commercial flights, are currently going into the affected countries?
I don't have the exact numbers.
Does anyone on the panel know how many commercial flights are going into these areas? Mr. Wagner, you don't know?
From the United States or from anywhere?
From the United States into those areas?
There are no direct flights, commercial flights, from those 3 affected areas to the United States.
And into the area?
Into any of those
into West Africa?
There are flights into West Africa.
How many?
That I don't have offhand.
Anybody on the panel know how many? How many coming back into the United States?
There are no commercial flights coming directly into the United States from those 3 areas.
And what about Europe?
There's hundreds of flights a day coming from Europe.
Okay, so people traveling from West Africa to Europe to here?
That's generally how they would get here.
And 94% screening. How many flights are required daily, every other day or weekly, to get the supplies and personnel to the affected areas?
The quantity of supplies is quite large. We would have to get back to you in terms of the numbers, but there's huge quantities needed. But it's not just supplies, it's also personnel who need to move back and forth.
Well, if you could get back to me with that number, I would appreciate it. Now, Dr. Frieden, Nigeria, are you aware if Nigeria has a travel ban from the countries affected with the outbreak right now?
I believe that is not the case.
They do not. Okay. Dr. Frieden, one of the issues that have been brought up regularly to me back in the district, when I go home, what should I tell my local hospital and local doctors that they need to do to address Ebola?
The single most important thing they need to do is make sure that if anyone comes in with fever or other symptoms of infection, they need to ask where they've been for the past 21 days and whether they've been in West Africa.
And the training that a small local district hospital would receive, is that the same kind that a major metropolitan hospital would receive?
There are a variety of forms of training. We support hospitals. Hospitals are regulated by states, not by CDC.
Dr. Frieden, what do we need to do? We're entering the flu season now, as somebody else on the panel had mentioned. What do we need to do to make sure that people understand that there could be similar conditions, similar circumstances, so that we don't have a situation where people are indeed panicked?
The key issue, it is, as you point out, getting into flu season. By all means, get a flu shot. And for healthcare workers, anytime someone comes in with fever or other signs of infection, take a travel history. That's really important.
And Dr. Frieden, I just want to go back to what I said at the beginning. You mentioned that we can't have a travel ban because you're afraid of the impact that it would have, but you don't know how much personnel, equipment, and flights are currently in use.
My point earlier on was that if passengers are not allowed to come directly, there is a high likelihood that they will find another way to get here, and we won't be able to track them as we currently can.
But we're talking about supplies, equipment, and personnel. How many? How many flights? How many personnel? How much equipment?
The point I made earlier was that if we are not able to track people coming directly, we'll lose that ability to monitor them for fever, to collect their locating information, to share that with local public health authorities, and to isolate them if they're ill.
Mr. Chairman,
Gentleman's time has expired. Thank you. Now recognize Mr. Welsh for 5 minutes.
Thank you. I want to follow up on some of Mr. Gardner's questions. First of all, I want to understand this. There has been one person that came to the U.S., and then he infected 2 healthcare workers in Dallas, correct?
At this point, none of the 48 contacts he had before getting isolated have developed symptoms, and they're mostly well past the maximum incubation period, although not completely out of the woods.
All right. And
two
for
healthcare
everybody on the panel, it's code red. We have had very few, 2 instances of infection here in the United States, but this is such a highly contagious disease that we're on full alert, correct?
It's a disease that has it's a very severe disease. It's not nearly as contagious as some other diseases, but any infection in a healthcare worker is unacceptable.
That's right. And there's an enormous, enormous amount of public concern and apprehension about this. So we appreciate the full-on efforts that you're making. There's been some lessons learned from what happened to Dallas. The hospital's been forthcoming about mistakes that were made. And now what you're telling us is that there has been information provided to all our hospitals in the country about what protocols to follow, correct?
Correct.
Now, just on a practical level, is it feasible that all our hospitals are going to be in a position to provide state-of-the-art treatment, or does it really, as a practical matter, make sense for hospitals to contact you when they have a potential infection, for you to come, and then for us to have centers to which that individual who is infected can be treated?
Every hospital needs to be able to think it may be Ebola,
Right.
diagnose it, to call us as they do. We've had hundreds of calls, and then we will send a team to determine what is best for that hospital and that patient.
And then what we have also heard, Ms. Schakowsky asked this question, this is absolutely a public health infrastructure issue where it gets out of hand, correct?
Public health measures can control Ebola.
Right. And they have had effective measures in Nigeria where they've been able to contain it, but they have no public health infrastructure in these 3 countries where the epidemic is now getting some headway, correct?
Exactly.
All right. And then in the U.S., of course, we're fortunate to have a pretty good infrastructure, but we do have to have an answer, I think, to this question that is being asked about travel. That is a concern that people have because it is seen as a, quote, easy answer. And I just want to understand what the debate is within the medical community. You know, for a lot of us sitting up here, we're hearing from our constituents. It sounds like something that we can do, and that'll eliminate any possibility of an infection coming here. But that may be a psychological answer, but not necessarily an effective medical answer. All of us have been asking you to give your explanation, and anyone else can come in, as to why, from a medical standpoint, you have concluded that a total travel ban is inappropriate and not effective.
First off, many of the people coming to the U.S. from West Africa are American citizens, American passport holders. So that's one issue just to be aware of.
All right, and then, by the way, I don't have much time, but our healthcare workers, even if there's some risk of infection, if we're going to encourage people to go and do the important work, including our military personnel, we've got to take them back and make sure we can treat them if, in fact, they do get the illness, correct?
People travel, and people will be coming in.
And as I understand, you say there's basically a trade-off. If you have a full-off ban, there's going to be ways around it, and then you're going to lose the benefit of being able to track folks who may be infected, and then that could lead to a greater incidence of outbreak. So it's a trade-off. Is that essentially what's going on?
We're open to any possibility that will increase the safety of Americans.
Right. So are there some midpoints like that in terms of travel restrictions as opposed to a travel ban that may make sense, you in coordination with your colleagues, particularly Mr. Wagner?
We would look at any proposal that would improve the safety of Americans.
All right. This isn't about funding, so I'm not going to ask you because I think we would know what your answers would be. But I just want to share my concern that it was expressed by Ms. Castor. Mr. Chairman, we may want to have a hearing at some point about what is the funding requirements to make certain that the infrastructure this country needs to be in place before something happens is robust, it's strong, we've got people who are trained, they're ready to do the job, and they have everything that they need. So that's not today's hearing, but I think it's a question that we should address because with 20% across-the-board funding in NIH, I find that to be a reckless decision. With 12% at CDC, I think that is definitely the wrong direction. I think this Congress has to revisit our priorities on making certain that we have the public health infrastructure to be prepared to protect the American people.
I think I should say we are planning a second hearing, and in preparation for that, we'll also ask if NIH does have the flexibility now to transfer funds as well as HHS. We'll move forward on that. Who's next? I now recognize Mr. Griffith for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I believe we should have reasonable travel restrictions. Dr. Frieden, in answering a question of my colleague from Colorado, Mr. Gardner, you indicated that Nigeria didn't have any restrictions, and that is accurate. But I have in my possession, I'd ask that it be submitted to the committee for the record, a letter from Delegate Robert G. Marshall of Manassas, Virginia, to Governor Terry McAuliffe, Governor of the Commonwealth. And in that, he cites the International SOS, a prominent medical and travel security services company with more than 700 locations in 76 countries, reports that African countries have imposed total air, land, and water travel bans by persons from countries where Ebola is present. The countries include Kenya, Cape Verde, Cameroon, Mauritius, South Sudan, Namibia, Gambia, Gabon, Cote d'Ivoire, Rwanda, Senegal, Chad, and Kenya. South African Development Community members, 14 countries, only allows highly restricted entry from Ebola-affected regions with monitoring for 21 days and travel to public gatherings discouraged. I find that interesting, Dr. Frieden, because some of those countries have had previous outbreaks of Ebola themselves. Wouldn't you agree that that some of those countries have had to face Ebola before?
I would have to check the list carefully to know, but I'll take your word for it.
All right. I will tell you that this is a concern to a lot of our constituents and to mine as well, and I was checking my Facebook page recently when I saw that a Facebook friend of mine, a father from Virginia, asked for prayers for his daughter because she lives in the apartment complex with the first nurse, nurse number 1, as I think somebody referred to her earlier, and was very concerned. And while I think I know the answer, I'd like to get your answer so that I can reassure this father, and that is, his question is, if I count to 21 days and my daughter is not infected, at that point can I exhale and breathe a sigh of relief?
Not only can he do that, but he can do that now, because the first nurse only exposed one person, one contact, and that was only in the very early stages of her illness. So at most, one person from the community was exposed.
And I appreciate that. He also asked a second question. He said there's some suggestion coming out of Dallas that the patient's dog may be infected and may have infected other dogs through actual contact or by feces. Can the virus be transmitted by dogs? And I will tell you that I did some homework on this because I thought it was an interesting question and found a CDC publication from March of 2005 that did a study on dogs in Africa in the affected areas and a study in France as a control group. And they found that while dogs show antibodies for Ebola, they're asymptomatic. But the study went further to say that there's really a lot of questions about how Ebola is transmitted, and in some instances, Gabon in '96 and 2004, Republic of Congo likewise, 2004 in the Sudan, that there is a question mark as to whether or not, or how that Ebola outbreak occurred. It wasn't in the normal or standard ways. It wasn't human to human. And this report indicates that dogs might be, I don't want to scare folks, might be suspect. I guess my question to you is, isn't it true that we really don't know a whole lot about the various outbreaks of Ebola? And so when we're trying to assure the American people, just like previously we didn't think it would come to this country, and then we thought if it did get to this country, we wouldn't have any problems controlling it. Now we've got all kinds of people being monitored. Isn't it true there's still a lot of questions about how Ebola is spread?
Although we're still learning a lot about Ebola and every other organism that we study and that we control, we have a lot of information about Ebola. We have a good sense of how it's controlled, and we've looked at the issue of exposure to animals. We know that in parts of Africa, consumption of forest-living animals can be a cause. We don't know of any documented transmission from dogs to humans, but that's why the authorities, with our agreement, have quarantined the dog, and we will be helping them to assess that situation.
And it's also true that while we have no evidence of transmission from human to dogs, we really don't know if there can be. We have what we call in the law, I used to be a lawyer, you have a lack of evidence as opposed to negative evidence. We don't have clear evidence that you can't transmit it either. And what's interesting is that raised the question for me about, okay, we've got no restrictions on travel of human beings. How about the dogs? I called Customs. They said, well, our experts are there. And then after pushing them a little bit, they said, that's USDA. We call USDA. And Dr. Frieden, they said, that would be CDC. So I understand all of your reasons. While I don't agree with them completely, I understand the concerns about humanitarianism, et cetera. But don't you think we ought to at least restrict travel of dogs?
We'll follow up in terms of what's possible and indicated.
Okay. Now I recognize Mr. Yarmouth for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And before I begin my questioning, I'd like to submit for the record an article entitled, Will America's Fragmented Public Health System Meet the Ebola Challenge? By Mark Rothstein, who's the director of the Institute of Bioethics at the University of Louisville Medical School. I'd like to submit that for the record. Thank you. I'd like to thank the panel for their testimony and answering the questions. And this has been a very enlightening hearing. I also want to acknowledge at the beginning that the Kentucky Air National Guard, which is based in my district, is in Senegal right now providing the infrastructure for the 101st. So in their efforts, I want to acknowledge their participation in this effort. At the risk of displaying my ignorance, we apparently know that you cannot detect the Ebola until the same time it becomes symptomatic, when it becomes contagious. Is there any other kind of test that would indicate whether anything's going on in the body? I know that sometimes my doctor will say, well, you've got an elevated white blood cell count, something's going on there. It may not know exactly what it is. Is that true of the Ebola, or would that not indicate that something's going on?
At this point, we don't have a test that would identify it before someone has symptoms. In fact, the test only turns positive when they're sick, and the test is for the virus itself. And that's why, that's another reason, besides the patterns of disease, that we're confident that it doesn't spread. We can't even find tiny amounts of it in people's body until they get sick.
Is there any research being done as to a possible test, earlier test for this?
There's a lot of research being done to try to understand and diagnose and treat and prevent better.
Good. I am a media person by background. That's where I spent most of my career, so I'm very sensitive to how the media treat situations like this. And certainly the media can be a very important part of providing public information about a potential threat to public safety as this is. But they can also go overboard, as we know. And I'm curious because I see every day comments in the media about the spread of Ebola and outbreaks of Ebola. And while, yes, technically it has spread from one person to two healthcare workers, I know that the public may hear that very differently and perceive there to be a much broader and widespread incident of Ebola in the country. And I see things like, for instance, in the Washington Post today, the picture of the woman at Dulles Airport who looks like she's mummified because of her concern of contracting Ebola. So, and I know that now one survey showed 98% of the American people are aware of the Ebola situation, and not even 50% know there's an election coming up in 3 weeks. So the media has certainly let the public know that there's something going on. My question to you is, has the media coverage so far been helpful or harmful in your efforts to have the public have an appropriate concern and awareness of what the situation is?
Well, anytime healthcare workers become infected and ill in this country, it's unacceptable, and our thoughts are with the two infected healthcare workers and hoping for their recovery. So it's certainly understandable that there's intense media interest. It's new to the United States. It's a scary disease. Had a movie made about it. And it's important to have that attention so that we as a society pay attention, and doctors in hospitals and community health clinics and primary care practices think of the possibility of Ebola, that we generate the societal will and resources to both protect Americans and stop it at the source, because it's got to be stopped at the source to make us completely safe. Some of the coverage, I think many would agree, may exaggerate the potential risks or may confuse people about the risks. There really is a lot we know about Ebola. CDC has an entire group of professionals who spend their careers working on Ebola and other similar infections. They go out and stop outbreaks all the time. We have stopped every outbreak of Ebola until the current one in West Africa. There's zero doubt in my mind that barring a mutation which changes it, which we don't think is likely, there will not be a large outbreak in the U.S. So I think we welcome the attention. It'd be important at times to put it in perspective.
I appreciate that. I agree totally. One final question in the last 30 seconds. Is there any additional authority that CDC would find more helpful in conducting or meeting your responsibilities? I know most of yours is guidance and information, but is there any specific authority that Congress could grant you that would make your job, would make it easier for you to do your job?
We're looking at a variety of things, emergency procurement, for example, to see in conjunction with the administration whether there are some changes that might allow us to respond more quickly and effectively.
Okay. Thank you. I yield back.
Recognize Mr. Johnson for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman, and Dr. Frieden, thank you for being here. Thank all of you on the panel for being here today. This is not about politics. It's not about international diplomacy. It's about public health and protecting the public safety of the American people, particularly our health care workers who, if I understood correctly, you've acknowledged are some of the high-risk folks to be exposed. One of my main concerns, Dr. Frieden, is that we don't know what we don't know. Throughout testimony and questioning today, I've heard you say multiple times, I don't know the details of this. I don't know the details of that. And I think what the American people are wanting is some assurance that somebody does know the details. So let me ask you a question. Do we know yet how the 2 healthcare workers in Dallas were contracted the virus? Was it a breakdown in the protocol? Was it a breakdown in the training of the protocol? Do we know whether or not the protocol works?
The investigation is ongoing. We've identified some possible causes. We're not waiting for the investigation to be completed.
So we don't know.
We're immediately implementing safety measures.
I get that. We don't know. You know, the people in Ohio are concerned, especially now that we know that one of those healthcare workers traveled through Ohio, even spent some time in Akron with family members. I applaud Governor Kasich's immediate actions to try and address the situation. You know, in my experience as a military war planner, 26 and a half years in the military, and I know we've got military engaged in this process overseas, we don't wait until the bullets start flying to figure out whether our war plan is going to work. Dr. Frieden, when did the CDC find out that there was an outbreak of Ebola in West Africa?
Late March.
Late March. Has there been, one of the things that we do in the military is that we conduct what's called operational readiness inspections. We give real-world scenarios in controlled environments, no notice, so that those who are going to be responsible for executing a war plan knows what to do when the first shot is fired. No panic, no second guessing. They know what to do. Has the plan to address an Ebola outbreak ever been tested by the CDC in a real-world environment?
Not only has the plan been tested, but outbreak control has been done multiple times in parts of Africa. What had not been done is in this part of Africa, which had never seen.
No, I'm talking about here in America.
In America also, we do a series of preparedness plans, for example.
Which, do you know of any hospitals in eastern and southeastern Ohio that have participated in any kind of real-world scenario of an Ebola outbreak?
I can't speak to that specific example now.
Okay, let me go a little bit further. You mentioned earlier that 150 per day, roughly, are coming in from West Africa. I think Mr. Wagner indicated 94% screening. Let me give you a scenario. Let's say a person comes in to the country from West Africa, and let's assume that everything in the screening process works right. They're maybe in day 14 of having been exposed to Ebola in West Africa. They show up here in America with no symptoms. They go through the screening process, and so they go on about wherever they go, Akron, Cleveland, Cincinnati, Los Angeles, wherever. Day 17 or 18, they start getting ill, and they start seeing a spike in their temperature. If they walk into any emergency room in Appalachia, Ohio, and start throwing up, having symptoms, does your plan identify that? And does your plan tell that hospital emergency room what to do in that scenario? They don't know that person came from Liberia or any other place.
We have detailed checklists and algorithms that we've distributed widely, provided repeated trainings and information so that healthcare providers throughout the country have a detailed checklist of what to do step by step by step to determine whether the person has Ebola. If they do, to call for help, and we will be there.
Okay. Mr. Chairman, I yield back.
Thank you. Mr. Green's next in line, but we're looking for him, so Mr. Matheson is next for 5 minutes.
Well, thank you, Mr. Chairman. I have a number of questions. I'll try to move through them quickly. Dr. Frieden, as was mentioned by a couple of people in their opening statements, it strikes me that controlling the outbreak in West Africa is really one of the real key issues to keeping Americans safe. Their reports indicate we may still be losing some ground in Liberia. So I guess I'd ask the question, what would enhance the international community's ability to gain control of the situation in West Africa in terms of actions and resources?
The fight against Ebola in West Africa is challenging. The health systems are weak. What we're finding is that it's moving quickly, and there's a real risk it will spread to other parts of Africa. Therefore, the key ingredient to progress there is speed. Because the outbreak is increasing so quickly, the quicker we surge in a response, the quicker we blunt the number of cases, and the risk to other parts of the world, including the U.S., decreases.
And are you resource constrained in that context?
Congress has provided money or approval or agreement to use money for the Department of Defense. USAID has resources going in. At CDC, we received, through an anomaly, $30 million for the first 11 weeks of this fiscal year, which we appreciate.
Let me ask you, you have a number, the CDC has a number, an unprecedented number of people in the field right now in West Africa and in Texas. How many people do you have deployed doing airport screenings?
I would have to give you get back to you with the exact number. We're working both to oversee the screenings in West Africa and make sure they're done correctly, and to screen individuals here, collect information on them, and transfer that information.
It'd be interesting to get that number and also find out if those resources are best used there or elsewhere with your limited number of people. That'd be interesting to hear. Following up on Mr. Yarmouth's questioning, is there a development of a more rapid test to determine if someone has Ebola than what we use today?
A more rapid test would be very helpful. The U.S. Navy has a pilot test in development. We're currently testing that in parts of West Africa. It's simpler, quicker, and would be very helpful, even if it isn't quite as sensitive in West Africa.
Gotcha. Yeah.
But we're working with a number of commercial manufacturers also on a more rapid test than there is currently.
It seems to me that when it comes to infection control and prevention and hospital epidemiology standards, I think they vary widely from hospital to hospital in this country. What legislative or regulatory actions could strengthen these systems? I mean, to the end, how can we reduce this variability among hospitals in our country?
Infection control in our hospitals generally is a challenge, and something that CDC works hard with hospitals and state health departments and state governments to improve. Hospitals are regulated by the states within which they operate, and the issue of what could be done to improve infection control is complex. CDC has a large program, hospital infection prevention, and there we support regional efforts to share lessons and figure out new ways to do things better to prevent infections. And that kind of center of excellence model is a very important one.
But you're suggesting that while you can provide the information and the expertise and the guidance, the actual implementation and responsibility is still a state function more than a federal function. Do you think we should be looking at that issue?
In the U.S., we have a federalist system. The CDC provides information and input. There are roughly 5,000 hospitals in the country. We're not a regulatory agency.
Right. One other line of question. There's no good news about Ebola, but at least it is not an airborne, transmitted as an airborne entity. It's clearly that we don't want to underestimate its ability to be transmitted. And while the focus is on Ebola, and rightly so for this hearing, there are other airborne transmissible pathogens that ought to be of great concern to everyone, including this Congress, that exist around the globe today, MERS being one of them. Is this experience we've had with Ebola, how do we learn from it to make sure we are prepared for other human-to-human transmissible pandemics that may be maybe a higher rate of transmission than Ebola?
I think there are two major lessons. First, to prevent it at the source. If we had had the basic public health system in place in these three countries a year ago to find it, stop it, and prevent it, it would be over already. And second, within our country, to continue to support hospital preparedness, community preparedness, and fundamentally the public health measures to find, stop, and prevent health threats.
Okay, thanks, Mr. Chairman.
Mr. Long is recognized for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. And today we have referred to, people on the panel, people up here have referred to Nurse 1 and Nurse 2. And these are two young women that have dedicated their lives to helping other people, sick people. And to refer to them as Nurse 1 and Nurse 2 just doesn't set well with me. It's kind of reminiscent of Dr. Seuss' Thing 1 and Thing 2. These are not things. So for the record, I'd like to state that the first nurse to contract Ebola was Nina Pham. And the second nurse was Amber Joy Vinson. These are young women with families. I know one in particular has a fiance. And so I think that it would serve us well to remember that these are human beings that have dedicated, young women that have dedicated their lives to helping other people. And for them and nurses everywhere in their family, I'd just like to open with that. Dr. Frieden, you said in your testimony earlier that only by direct contact can you contract Ebola. Do you stand by that statement?
Direct contact with someone who's ill or died from Ebola or their body fluids.
And it's not airborne. Congressman Matheson just said, and you agreed, it's not an airborne, cannot be contracted airborne.
Ebola spreads person to person, not by the airborne route. So it's not like...
So you need personal contact.
Yes.
If you need personal contact with bodily fluids, why is there an airliner in the Denver airport right now that Frontier Airlines has scrubbed 4 times? Aren't they wasting money? Why can't they get that back in its service? If you have to have bodily contact, close contact, why scrub that airliner?
I understand that people are very concerned about Ebola. It's a scary disease. I can't comment on what exactly the airlines do.
So it's just for public perception. I mean, they really don't need to be doing that, right?
We have detailed guidelines along with the EPA for how to clean airlines.
Do you need a fever to be contagious?
You need to be sick. Generally, the first symptom of illness is fever.
So do you need a fever to be contagious?
Late in the disease, when people are deathly ill, they may not have fever, but they would be likely to be able to walk at that point.
This 21-day period that you need to show symptoms within 21 days from exposure, during that could you be contagious at the 3rd day of that point?
Only if you were sick, only if you had symptoms.
Okay. And the incubation period is anywhere from 0 to 21 days?
2 to 21 days, generally within the first 10 days or so.
You said here today that there's 100 to 150 people a day coming from West Africa into the United States. You're opposed to travel restrictions, which the constituents in the 7th District in Missouri are very much in favor of travel restrictions. I predict you're going to put on, or the President's going to put on, travel restrictions. I don't know if it's going to be today or tomorrow or 2 weeks or a month from now, but I think that they're coming, and I think sooner rather than later. If there's 150 a day and you rationalize, well, we don't really need to worry about that because they could get cross borders, they could go by land and then get here. If that 100 and 150 a day, don't you think that number might be reduced to 5 or 10 a day if we did put on travel restrictions?
I can't comment on what numbers would...
If someone had to make an effort other than going out to their local airport and jumping on a plane, if they really had to try to get here, don't you think that number would dramatically drop?
I know that people do come back, and right now we're able to screen them, collect their information.
What if they don't come back? A lot of people come in this country and we lose track of them. They don't come back. What happens then? My point is, if you got 150 a day coming in or you have 5 coming in today, I and my constituents would rather have 5 a day coming in. And this thing of checking for temperatures like it's going to help is kind of like scrubbing a plane that doesn't need to be scrubbed. But I'd like to commend the folks reading this copy of Bloomberg Business Week. Ebola is coming to America. The U.S. had a chance to stop the virus in its tracks, but it missed. That issue came out before Mr. Duncan came to this country and before he was diagnosed with Ebola. There's some good reading in there that I would recommend. I'd also recommend, too, if you want to Google, a hospital from hell is swamped by Ebola. The New York Times, just a few days ago. Hospital from hell. If you get a chance to read that, I think that everyone would be in favor of the travel restrictions we've talked about here today. And today, OSHA, Occupational Safety and Health Administration, just today said that Customs and Border Patrol immigration enforcement agents are at risk. of coming into contact with Ebola. Mr. Wagner, are we prepared for that? Are your agents, are they protected to the fullest extent what they need? This just came out today.
We issue them personal protective gear, and we train them on how to wear it and what circumstances to wear it. But they encounter all different kinds of travelers with a whole host of different potential communicable diseases. So, you know, we are aware and we do train to recognize signs of overt illness, and then we have the protocols with the health professionals to get those travelers into that care and to protect our employees.
To me, they fall in the same category the nurses. They're there to save us and help people and protect people in this country. So God bless them. I'll yield back.
Gentleman's time has expired. Gentlelady from North Carolina, Mrs. Elmers.
Thank you so much, Mr. Chairman, and I have a number of questions. I'd like to start with Dr. Varga in regard to the 2 nurses that were exposed. My understanding is one of the nurses, the first nurse, Ms. Fan, was exposed in the emergency room. Is that correct?
I'm sorry, could you repeat the question, please?
The first nurse was exposed in the emergency room. Is that correct?
No, that would not be correct. Nina was one of our ICU nurses and first came in contact with Mr. Duncan when Mr. Duncan was transferred from the emergency department up to the ED.
So that was sometime from the September 28th to the 30th. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay, and then the second nurse, Ms. Vincent, was she also an ICU nurse?
That's correct.
Okay, so they were exposed after the point that we would have already started recognizing that Ebola was being questioned. Is that correct?
No, that's not correct. The nurses in the MICU, from the time they had first contact with Mr. Duncan, were in personal protective equipment according to the CDC guidelines.
Mm-hmm.
Nina, what cared for Mr. Duncan.
Okay, Dr. Varga, I'm going to stop you right there. So they were already using universal precautions, but also were using some of the more isolation. And just answer yes or no.
Yes.
Okay. To that, I'd like to move on. Dr. Frieden, this, of course, and I'll just back up. On October 6th, I sent a letter to the CDC, to CBP, and HHS calling for travel restrictions. So there's no question, I believe travel restrictions need to be put in place. And now, after having this subcommittee hearing, I believe even more strongly that we need them. And I just want to back up to a couple questions for Dr. Frieden and Dr. Fauci. Do we know the strain, are there multiple strains of Ebola?
There are 5 different subspecies. This outbreak is one particular subspecies, Ebola Zaire, and all of the strains that we've seen have been closely related.
Okay, so we know that it's isolated to one particular strain.
Yes.
Now, you had mentioned, and I believe the quote was, unless it mutates, there will not be an outbreak here in the United States. Is that correct?
There will not be a large outbreak here, barring a mutation.
Well, the question I have is, when the nurses were using the protective gear then, how is this that this has happened? It tells me that something is changing here, and are we currently looking into this situation right now?
We're absolutely looking for other mutations or changes. What we have seen is very little change in the virus. We don't think it is spreading by any different way.
So and you've already said a couple of times that you don't believe that this is airborne, and yet, there again, I know how nurses are. I was one for 21 years before coming to Congress. You're protecting yourself, you're protecting your patient, you're protecting your family. They followed precautions, I am sure, and now we're having this conversation, and I'm very concerned about that.
We are confident this is not airborne transmission. These nurses were working very hard. They were working with a patient who was very ill, who was having lots of vomiting, lots of diarrhea. There was a lot of infectious material, and the investigation is ongoing, but we immediately implemented a series of measures to increase the level of safety.
Okay, I'm going to move on. Dr. Borio, in the discussion of fast-tracking a test for Ebola, where is the FDA on that? Is there a fast-track process right now that you know of?
For diagnostic tests?
Yes.
Sure. So there are 3 diagnostic tests that are authorized for use under our EUA authorities. And we have also taken some proactive steps by contacting manufacturers, commercial manufacturers, who we know have potential interest technologies to be brought to bear here. And we reached out to a handful who might be interested in working with us.
Okay. So you're in the process of looking towards a fast-track process?
Yes, we would expedite every such test.
Great, thank you. And then, Dr. Frieden, lastly, you know, there again, I'm speaking on behalf of my constituents and every American in this country. I just don't believe that it is acceptable that the quote that you have given us, we won't be able to track them, as the reasoning for why we should not implement travel restrictions. I do believe we can. And Mr. Wagner, as far as our Customs and Border Patrol, do you believe that there is a way that we can implement tracking? Tracking of individuals if we do not allow them to come?
We have ways to determine a person's itinerary and travel history through the questioning or review of the passport. It's easier when they're coming on a direct ticket from those places.
True. But as you pointed out, they're coming from hundreds. Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I thank you for indulging my overtime here.
Now recognize Mr. Scalise for 5 minutes.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. I appreciate you holding this hearing, and I want to thank all of the panelists for coming and participating. I know I've talked to a number of healthcare professionals as well as many of my constituents, and listening to the panel as well. I want to join with Chairman Upton in urging the President to immediately institute a travel ban until such time that they can firmly and scientifically prove that Americans are safe from having more Ebola patients coming into the United States. And I know, Dr. Frieden, you expressed disagreement with that. Have y'all had any conversations within the White House about a travel ban and whether or not the President has the authority? Because many of us have said the President does have the authority to do it today.
From the point of view of CDC, we're willing to consider anything that will reduce
But have you
risk
considered that? And have you ruled it out, or have you not considered it at all? Have you had conversations with the White House about a travel ban? That's a yes or no question. Have you had conversations with the White House about a travel ban?
We've discussed many aspects.
How about a travel ban? Have you had that conversation
We've
with
had
anyone in the White
discussions
House?
on the issue of travel to and from West Africa.
And have y'all ruled it out?
I can't speak for the White House. I can tell you
You can
that
speak for the CDC. If you were in those conversations, maybe they had their own conversations without you, but if you were involved in conversations with the White House about a travel ban, did they rule it out? Are they still considering it?
From the CDC's perspective, we will consider anything that will better protect
So are
Americans.
you going to answer the question about your conversations with the White House? Is the White House considering a travel ban?
I can't speak for the White House.
Do you know if they've ruled out a travel ban?
I can't speak for the White House.
Have you had conversations with them about it?
We've discussed the issue of travel.
All right, I would urge you, at a minimum, if you've ruled out a travel ban, if you don't think it's the right way to go, there are a lot of people that would disagree with you, at a minimum, you ought to look at least immediately suspending visas to non-U.S. nationals seeking to travel into the United States from Sierra Leone, Liberia, and Guinea. Have you all considered that or discussed it or ruled it out?
At CDC, our authority is to quarantine individuals or require the isolation of individuals.
But earlier you said you don't think there should be a travel ban. What about at least looking at suspending visas to non-U.S. citizens? Have you looked at that?
CDC doesn't issue visas.
But you can make a recommendation to the White House that it would be in the best interest of the American people to have that kind of suspension issued, can't you? Are you not aware of that?
We would certainly consider anything that will reduce risk to Americans.
Let me ask you this. Do you have a high level of confidence that our U.S. troops that are over there right now, I've got estimates that around 350 U.S. troops are already in those 3 affected countries. Up to 3,000 troops are going to be sent over by President Obama. Do you have a high level of confidence that those U.S. troops are protected with all the protocols in place so that they will not contract Ebola?
We've worked very closely with DOD on their protocols.
So do you have a high level of confidence that they're protected?
I would not say that there's zero risk. They are in those countries, but they are not participating in high-risk activities that would put them at risk.
Are you consulting with DOD? Who establishes the protocols in that case? Is CDC involved in that?
CDC, they are following the CDC protocols, but they follow their own.
Let me ask you about the protocols, because I've read reports that some people with some of the other organizations that have been over there for a while, you've got the group Samaritan's Purse, a gentleman by the name of Sean Kaufman, who's involved with some of the doctors that have been over there that have gotten infected. They've been working for decades in some cases. He said that he warned your agency that the guidelines that you had on Ebola were lax, and his response was, quote, "They kind of blew me off," meaning your agency blew him off when he was warning you that your protocols were lax. Are you aware of that?
I saw that quotation. We take all suggestions.
Have you identified who blew him off in your agency?
I don't know that that occurred.
Well, I would hope that you'd go and find out, because there's a real concern. You know, one of the biggest concerns I get from the hospitals in my district that I've talked to, and I've talked to a number of hospital officials, medical officials, professionals in my district, they're concerned that they haven't had consistent protocols. There's been at least 4 just in the last few weeks where the protocols keep changing. Now, with the nurse, the first nurse that was infected, I believe you personally said that the protocols were breached originally. Have you backed away from that?
We're looking at what might have
You said the protocols were breached. Were the protocols breached with the first nurse that was infected? Yes or no?
Our review of the records suggests that in the first few days of
If you didn't know for a fact, you shouldn't have said
time's
it.
expired.
Do you withdraw that statement, or do you still stand by the statement that protocols were breached by the first nurse?
there was a definite exposure that resulted.
Were protocols breached,
Gentleman's
yes or
time's
no?
expired.
Yield back.
Thank you. Is a tradition of this committee that the ranking member and the chairman have a final 2-minute wrap-up. Ms. DeGette, 2 minutes.
Dr. Frieden, would it be fair to say that it looks like the first nurse, Ms. Pham, was exposed in the first couple of days before the diagnosis came in?
That's our leading hypothesis at this point.
Thank you. Now, Dr. Varga, we've still got you, I hope.
Yes, I'm here.
Have you now seen my chart from the New York Times about the protective gear?
Yes, ma'am.
Do you know which of these types of protective gear Ms. Pham and the other healthcare workers were wearing during those first 2 days?
Ms. Hahn would have been wearing, or Nina would have been wearing the second garb. The folks in the ED most likely would have been wearing the first picture.
Okay, thank you. So it's your testimony. You don't really know how Ms. Pham was, well, either one of these wonderful nurses were exposed. Is that correct?
That's correct.
Okay. I just want to say one last thing. I think that we've had a lot of discussion today about a lot of issues, and my takeaway is this, and Dr. Frieden, I guess I'm going to make a statement, and I'd ask you to comment on it. Seems to me that aside from trying to stop this Ebola in Africa, the thing we can do here is, number one, we can give better training to the people in our emergency rooms and our first responders, not just send them out emails or bulletins. Number two, we can have more robust protective gear at an early stage if somebody looks like they might have a risk for Ebola. And number three, I think it might be really useful to put CDC on the ground much earlier. Here, they didn't come into this Dallas hospital until after the diagnosis. So there was 2 days when people were moving in and out of Mr. Duncan's room, and we don't know exactly what happened. Dr. Frieden, could you comment very briefly on that?
Agree completely on the training. We're looking very carefully at the personal protective equipment issue. We consult immediately every time, and there have been more than 300 consultations for hospitals that have thought they might have a patient with Ebola. Only Mr. Duncan was confirmed to have Ebola. We can't be everywhere. Everyone has to do their part, but we will do everything we can to support the front lines.
And Mr. Chairman, I'd ask for both this protective gear chart and also our map of the flights to be included in the record. And I would also ask all of our witnesses if they would continue to keep this committee updated as to changes in procedures or developments that are made as we go along. And I'd ask unanimous consent to put any other members' opening statements in the record.
Mr. Chairman, I had previously asked for unanimous consent for the letter that I quoted.
Yes, that is granted.
I don't think we ever agreed on it, but
it's so ordered. No,
thank you.
Now I recognize myself for a final 2 minutes. So Having listened to all your testimony, a couple of things that stand out for me. One, I appreciate Dr. Daniel Vargas' statement of honesty that we've made mistakes. I didn't hear that from many of you, and that troubles me. Because what has happened here is your protocol depends on everyone being honest 100% of the time. I'm not a medical expert. I study behavior as a psychologist, and people are not honest 100% of the time. Secondly, it relies on tools for taking temperatures, which have their own reliability and validity issues. A 1 in 21 chance during those 21 days it may register something, and a person can mask it with some analgesics. So that's not helpful. We also have to recognize human behavior. The protocols may not be followed. That's why you have a fail-safe system of basically a buddy watching you put on your garb, watch you take it off, making sure you use other things. And I think the example of how this failed was there's an assumption in the travel, Dr. Frieden, you said CDC granted her travel with the assumption that she used all the right protective gear, but we looked at this and you're not aware of what she wore, and it does not appear she wore the proper ones. So to this extent, these are my recommendations based on what we heard from this hearing. I believe we need an immediate ban on commercial non-essential travel from Guinea, Liberia, and Sierra Leone until we have an accurate and thorough screening process and we treat this disease. Number two, a mandatory quarantine order for any American who has treated an Ebola patient or has traveled to and returned from the Ebola hot zone countries. This includes a prohibition of domestic travel because of an assumption, and without this assumption that what they wore was donned and removed properly. Number three, immediate training and thorough training for U.S. healthcare hospital workers to include a review of personal protective equipment used in the treatment of possible Ebola-infected patients, their wear and removal. Number four, identify and designate specific medical centers equipped and trained to treat potential Ebola patients and expansion of those as soon as possible. Number five, identify gaps in statutory language that may prevent CDC and any other federal agency, including BARDA, FDA, and NIH, from taking more aggressive and immediate action to protect public health from Ebola, including letting us know of any abilities now to transfer funds immediately or any other action Congress needs to do to facilitate your needs. Number six, accelerate directives on development and deployment of clinical trials for all promising Ebola vaccines, investigational drugs, and diagnostic tests. Number seven, acquisition of additional airplanes and vehicles capable of transporting American medical and military personnel who may have contracted Ebola from Africa to return to the United States beyond the current capacity of 2. Number 8, additional contact tracing and testing resources for public health agencies. And number 9, to provide information to Congress regarding any resources needed to assist health interventions, aggressive health interventions in Africa, so that we can stop Ebola there. I appreciate all the members coming back today for this hearing, and I particularly appreciate the testimony of the panel. I ask unanimous consent that the members' written opening statements be introduced into the record. Without objection, the documents be entered into the record.
Yeah, I have a document to enter into the record, the Office of Inspector General, Department of Homeland Security, and then the photograph that I demonstrated earlier today.
So ordered. That will be included in the record. Again, thank all the
Mr.
witnesses and
Chairman?
members who have participated in the hearing.
Mr. Chairman?
Yes.
I just wanted an acknowledgement that the things I wanted included in the record.
Yes, those are included as
Thank
well. We will also have a hearing in November. We'll follow up. We'll notify members of the participants in that and when that will be. I ask all members to submit questions for the record and ask that the witnesses please agree to respond promptly to the questions. And with that, this hearing is adjourned.